I'm Sharon Constanson. I'm chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce in the UK. And today we are bringing I think it's about the 8th or 9th, if not 9th, in our series on Black empowerment. We have a good number of people attending with us today. So thank you very much for all taking the trouble on a Friday to join us. Arlene will be our first guest, who is a consultant to the Black Empowerment Chamber and will be sharing with us a video. So to begin with, and I know Arlene has a terrible, terrible time constraint, so she'll be with us for a few minutes and then I'll be taking over from Arlene thereafter. So Arlene, floor's all yours to begin.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon talking about the Employment Equity Act and the changes and amendments that have been made. I've got a short video, like Sharon has explained, that I'm going to quickly play. 1 second.
BEE Chamber. In 2010, the National Development Plan set a goal to increase the employment rate from 13.6 million to 24 million people by 2030. The number of individuals employed needs to increase by 9 million between now and 2030. Then BEE was introduced in 2007 to secure contributions from government and business towards economic growth, enabling inclusion of more South African citizens to address unemployment and alleviate poverty. If the National Development Plan and BEE was designed to grow the GDP and create jobs, then why has unemployment increased after their introduction? Our population has grown from 41 million in 1994 to 60 million people today. In that time, the number of employed South Africans has also grown by 6 million, from 8.9 million to 15 million, representing a growth in employment rate from 20% to 28.5%. However, the unemployment rate has increased over the same period from 22% to 32.6% because population growth has outperformed job creation by a factor of 3 times. What this means is that South Africa's population growth has outperformed the country's job creation. The distribution of unemployment remains highly racially skewed, with white unemployment sitting at only 8.8%, which is on par with France and is lower than Italy and Brazil. Whereas the South African Indian unemployment rate is 11.8, colored 25.7, and African 36.5, making African unemployment the 7th highest in the world. The exceptionally high unemployment rates for Indian, colored, and especially African men and women is the reason for Black economic empowerment in South Africa and the reason for the objective of the BEE Act being meaningful participation in the mainstream economy for Black people. Join the BEE Chamber today to understand more about the original intent behind BEE and how you can align your business targets and plans to contribute as a good corporate citizen and to achieve a level of pride from your corporate contributions. As a member, you will access up-to-date information, support, guidance, services, software and training to support your transformation journey.
Thank you very much for watching our video, and I hope you found the statistics very interesting and it gave you a better understanding of why broad-based Black economic empowerment actually exists in South Africa. I'd like to now hand over to Sharon for her.
Thanks very much, Arlene. Thanks very much for your contribution, and I wish you luck with the meetings that you're going to be holding now. I'm now going to introduce Frik Boonzaaier. Frik has a BA in psychology and has dedicated the past 17 years to assisting businesses in the management of their people. He's well positioned in a senior Black Empowerment SA Association's transformation consulting team and is a senior human capital consultant. I'd like to also introduce Usha Jivan. Usha is an attorney and is one of the founder, shareholders and directors in a company called B-Score. So BEE involvement, and it's where we created the Score app environment, where they're able to have a look at the different ratings that companies can come out with. She's delivered papers internationally and nationally. She's also got a passion in family law. She helps people pro bono in the Durban courts when they need help. And she's had many serious legal professional titles that she's held. You will have all seen her bio on the website. And I think, Frik, to the best of my knowledge, you have a presentation. So maybe you would like to start with that.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sharon. Thanks, everybody, for joining from my side. So there is limited time, so I'm going to jump right into it. So the purpose, obviously, of today is to get some sort of an idea of what the impact is of the amendments that we are going to see being implemented soon. So I've just got a few slides. It's really just the highlights of what we should take into consideration. I'm going to highlight to you what are those major amendments time frame. There's quite a bit of grey at the moment in terms of what's going to happen when. So I just want to highlight that to you. We've got sectoral targets that are coming up, just to look at what those are. Then there's quite a bit of confusion. So I want to, in the session, just sort of alleviate some of the confusion that's been created in the media around what happens with what. So things like EAP targets, what happens with that? We've always had that as a benchmark. So what's going to happen with EAP? So I want to just highlight where that fits in. I want to then just show you how do you treat the sectoral targets. So when you are needing to do strategies for going forward, how do you, how do you approach that? And then just lastly, so, what now? What do we do next? So just firstly, what are the major, the highlights of the changes? So for those of you who are not familiar, the president has signed into law. So in April, we had the president sign. What we don't have yet is an effective date. So we don't know from which date onwards will companies need to implement according to the amendments. So one of the major things, turnover threshold. So small companies will no longer be designated, meaning that they will no longer need to comply in terms of needing to report, needing to develop employment equity plans, etc. So in the past, if you had a turnover in excess of a particular turnover for your industry, even if you had less than 50 employees, you would still be designated. Going forward, it's only going to be 50 plus employees in a company that will make that company designated. So that's quite a significant change for small businesses. Going forward, if you want to do business with government, you're going to have a certificate of compliance with the Employment Equity Act. And that's basically going to indicate whether you are meeting the targets that you've set in line with the sectoral targets. But we'll speak about the sectoral targets a bit more later. They will also look at whether there's been any CCMA cases won against the company in terms of unfair discrimination. But without this certificate, you're not going to be able to do work with the government. I believe that soon companies that are really into corporate governance, etc., will start asking those certificates from their suppliers as well. So although the law caters for the government being able to ask for that certificate, I believe that it's going to filter down into the business environment as well. So I've mentioned we're going to have sectoral targets. So for each sector, there are per employment equity level, per region, there are sectoral targets. And the purpose of this is that the government wants us to, within 5 years, reach at least the sectoral targets. I'm going to focus a bit on this area. So for now, I just want to step off of it, and then we'll look at it in a bit more detail. So the draft sectoral targets have been gazetted. We don't have final ones yet, and I'll explain to you on the next slide in terms of a time frame. What are we looking at? Let me keep that comment for you. So this is the time frame that I can tell you where we've been and what still needs to happen. So in April, the president signed the amendments into law. We don't have an effective date yet. What I mean by that is we don't know yet from which date onwards do we need to implement employment equity plans. that have included the sectoral targets. So from when on, we need to actually implement this act. We don't know, we don't have that date yet. On the 12th of May, the department gazetted the draft regulations, and those included draft sectoral targets. So that's still where we are at. We've seen the draft sectoral targets, and they were published for 30-day public comment until the 12th of June. So we are now beyond that part, and at the moment then the department is reviewing the public comment that has been received. So the next couple of sort of slots in terms of this time frame is, you'll see that's all question marks because we don't know what that time frame will be. Last year, it was communicated that from September onwards this year, we would need to implement these amendments. But again, like I said, that implementation date has not been gazetted yet. And I also foresee that we now have too limited time to be able to meet that deadline. If we say that 12th of June would be the date on which the public comment ended, I would imagine that at least for 30 days, this would carry on at least until the middle of July, and that would be best case scenario. And that would really leave us, if they publish final sectoral targets, middle of July, then that's going to leave us with 6 weeks to before we are at the point where we need to implement. And that sort of time frame is really not sufficient for bigger businesses, especially if you've got to consult with various fora, there are different business units, you've got to consolidate all of these things. It doesn't take 6 weeks. So I'm a bit weary. I don't think that we will see the September deadline, but the department might stick to their guns and say we need to implement from there onwards. Also, just to mention, there are court challenges, and all of this could have an impact on this timeline as well. Right, so those draft sectoral targets. Firstly, I said that we need to just understand apologies for that, what happens with EAP going forward. So the draft sectoral targets, and what we need to understand is we have always had targets. The EAP has always been the target since 1998. So there have been no changes in terms of that. So there's EAP. So if we think about African males, for instance, 43% more or less is where we should be heading at each level in our business, then that's always been the case. Now they are saying EAP remains the benchmark. We are going to say to you, in 5 years, you must be there. Next 5 years, you must be there, et cetera, et cetera. But EAP remains the ultimate benchmark. I don't have enough time to go into detail here, but you'll have access to the slides. So all I want to mention here is this section 42 in the Act. The black part here we've always had, so no changes there. And the point A specifically there refers to EAP being our benchmark. We're adding point B, which then says, yes, by a certain time, you're going to have to at least meet the sectoral targets. So understand there are interim targets, but if you aim for EAP, you will meet the sectoral targets as well. Okay, so how do we treat this now? And I think of everything, this particular slide will give you the best idea in terms of what needs to happen going forward. So what you see on this slide, this is just an example, a senior management example. We always compare to EAP. So you can see the blue line across at the top, the lighter blue line. That is the national EAP in this example. We've got an actual, which would be the orange columns there. And you've got your BEE targets, obviously, that you also need to consider. But then you'll have your sectoral targets, which you can see are the gray ones. And you will notice that all of the gray targets are below the EAP targets. And this is where we say they are interim targets that have been set to move you closer to EAP. So when you are now planning, because soon we're going to have to develop new plans that will include the sectoral targets, how do you plan? The principle is you need to plan over a 5-year period to at least meet the sectoral target. and you need to make sure to remain below the EAP. So somewhere between the gray and the blue line is where you need to set your targets for African males at senior management, just as an example. Another example here, African females would be somewhere again between the gray line and the blue line. And what you will then need to do is, we are here at the moment for African females. Year 1, where do we want to be? Year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5, to land up somewhere, like we said, between the gray and the blue lines there. And so that's basically the principle that we're going to have to apply going forward when we are setting our targets. But again, you can see it's heading towards EAP. So last comment before we then just go into a discussion is to say that if we don't meet your targets, you're going to have to be able to justify why you have not met them. So in the 2018 draft regulations, we had an indication of what would those reasons be that are the acceptable justifications. And also in the recent agreement between the department and Solidarity, these are also contained in that agreement to say we will be able to justify not meeting targets based on these particular aspects. Just notice again, still, this is also draft regulations, so they are not in effect yet, but it is now also contained in that agreement, which gives us a very strong indication that this is what will be applied. When we say justification, it means I am able to prove whatever I'm saying. So it's not going to be a question of, let's look through the list. Oh, let's pick that one. It sounds like the most possible reason. You're going to, if you say, for instance, we had limited recruitment and promotion opportunities, you're going to have to indicate that we advertised this position, we received 100 CVs, only 3 people met the minimum job requirements, and none of them were from the most underrepresented group in our company, let's say African females. So you're going to need to be able to prove specifically if you're going to use a particular justification. So we spoke about recruitment, promotion, but then also the pool of available candidates. If you can't find people with particular skills, you're going to have to, then you be able to justify. But you would also then need to show how, what am I doing to create a pool of people to be able to go into specific types of positions. There could be court orders that says this particular company is exempt from the sectoral targets, and that could be in the nursing industry, for instance, where there's a shortage in general of nurses. If we now set nursing or targets for African male, colored male, Indian male, and there just are not enough people around, then there might be a court order. They might be able to get a court order to that effect. If there are major changes to the business, acquisitions or downscaling, etc., all of those things you would be able to use as justification. Right, Sharon, that was what I think the highlights of what we can expect going forward. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks very much. Usha, will you join us?
Okay, good afternoon.
Have you got something you would like to present for us?
No, I don't have a presentation. I think it's going to be an exchange of a conversation with questions between Frik and myself. So we have a few questions for each other, is my understanding of what will happen now.
I shall leave you.
Good. Thank you. Frik, can we do it this way? I'll ask you the one question and then you ask me the first question and we move forward from there.
Yes, that's fine, no problem.
Okay, cool. My question to you is that there has been significant confusion with the media having highlighted that the draft sectoral targets do not calculate to 100%. Is it a mistake, or do you have any idea why they don't add up to 100%?
Yeah, so no, we do have an idea. So like I mentioned, if you look at the sectoral targets, they are minimum percentages. So let's say in senior management, you need to by 2028 reach, let's say 25% in senior management, then that would be the minimum. But the rest would be made up of all of the other groups. So let's say your white males might sit on 60%, but the EAP or the sectoral target sits on 4.5%. So it just says each of these groups must get to a minimum of this. But if we don't meet the EAP, that means another group is going to be overrepresented still. Let's say it might be white males. So the rest can be sort of made up of any of the other groups, but we need to meet those minimums that have been set as sectoral targets. So they're not supposed to actually add up to 100%.
Okay, great. No, thanks for that. You have a question for me?
Yes. So there's been claims in South Africa that there will be thousands of jobs that will be lost specifically by coloureds and Indians. Do you agree that this will happen? What are your views on what might happen in this space?
Yeah, I don't think that that's going to happen. And perhaps before I even explain why, we talked about timelines, but it's very interesting to note that the Employment Equity Amendment Bill was actually gazetted as far back as July 2020. And of course, during that period, it did not become law because there were quite a lot of stakeholders who were opposed to the bill because they thought that it was unconstitutional, and hence the president didn't sign off that bill. Now we fast forward to April and May 2023 and to where we are right now. So yeah, the reason I say that that's probably not going to happen also is that there's been a lot of engagement. There have been certain reports that were I think it was the 23rd of June this year, the Annual Commission for Employment Equity report was released as well. And also that report shows a very bleak picture of very slow transformation in the country. And the chairperson of the Commission for Employment Equity was launching this report to say that top management is still occupied by whites at about 63%. I think it was 62.9%, followed by Africans at 16.9%. And this is also despite the fact that Africans constitute 80% of the national economically active population in South Africa. Of course, that, the African is followed by coloureds at 9.3%, whites at 8%, and Indians at 2.7%. But the reason I say that it will not happen is simply because of the settlement agreement that was reached recently by means of at the CCMA. So this conciliation process happened, and I think that there's been a settlement agreement now, which has yet to be implemented and finally approved. But according to the settlement agreement, it has been made pretty clear that in order to settle this matter, there should be no absolute barrier that should be placed upon any employment practices affecting any persons from any group, which includes all the groups. So in this particular case, I understand from that settlement agreement that one's got to take into account also in complying with affirmative action. The principle has always been, and I think it still is, that in any workplace, you have to have reasonable grounds for not complying with the targets that are set out by the employers. So there are many reasons why, because you look at the pool of qualified persons, you look at the qualification and the skills and the experience of members, of staff, the rate of turnover, etc. So I think the outcome of that settlement is that there should be no penalties or any form of disadvantage being incurred by any employer if in the compliance analysis of affirmative action in any workplace, if there are justifiable, reasonable grounds for not complying with those targets. So the targets don't necessarily have to be complied with. One's got to take into account all of these factors. So I think that the outcome of that was that no termination or no employment termination of any kind should be effected as a consequence of affirmative action. And that is why I believe that in response to to that point, that I don't think that would happen, that people would be dismissed.
All right.
Okay, and then maybe another question for you.
If you don't mind, Usha, can I just latch onto what you said as well? And that is that I think where this question comes from of certain groups going to be fired or whatever the case may be, is this misunderstanding about what I explained about the EAP, that the sectoral targets are minimums. So it's not like you may not go beyond and now get rid of people. So if there's a target for, you said colours are 9.3%, I think more or less. If you are now on 10%, it doesn't mean you're now going to have to get down to 9.3%. That's not the purpose. You must work towards that minimum, but you can have more. And that's where the confusion is coming. Yeah. So, so just to latch on a bit into what you said as well. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree with that. So Solidarity and the Department of Employment and Labor also very recently signed an agreement in terms of the employment equity implementation. Has anything changed since then? What has changed?
Yeah, so I think what you also basically said is the same as what my answer is going to be, is that not a lot really has changed. So you would know better than I do case law in terms of some of that agreement. There are many things that have already played out in the courts, and they have already said the things that are now contained in that agreement. What I do think is good that it is now sort of summarized in one place where the department says, yes, we agree, these are the principles that we're going to be applying. What's also interesting is that one of the aspects of what's been introduced by when the department checks for compliance of a company, if they inspect a company and they want to see whether there's compliance, in the initial 1998 Act, we had a list of certain things that the department would be looking for, pool of suitably qualified individuals, etc., to determine compliance. That was removed in 2013, effective 2014. But now in this agreement, it is back. And part of that agreement says that this will be gazetted as part of the regulations as well. So it comes back as law again. So those justifications, additional almost justifications that the department will need to take into consideration is back. But I think the message I just want to bring across is that when we see in the media that there's been this win, that things are suddenly different. And I think it's creating a bit of an idea that we don't need to comply as much anymore. It's going to be less. But nothing, the Act hasn't changed. We still need to do what the Act says. And yeah, you also mentioned this, that, to my view, not a lot is going to change, except we've got some more clarity in terms of that.
Correct, yeah. And I think we'll just await final implementation.
Yes. Absolutely. So it's always somewhere up in the air. Okay, obviously from your perspective on BEE being, your forte, so we're talking about employment equity today. So what would be the impact in terms of BEE? Is there one, also maybe just a comment before you answer, is that I have seen very few headlines that when the president actually signed that said employment equity changes. Majority of them said BEE changes coming. And that's also created a lot of confusion. So, so what is the link then is there one with the amendments?
These proposed amendments, as you say correctly, are linked to the employment equity regulations. And overview is that the regulations will not directly impact on the process of BEE verification, on the actual verifying and auditing of an entity. and issuing a certificate. So it's not going to directly impact, because BEE verification agencies must meet the requirements of the management control and the employment equity targets of the specific codes of good practice. I mean, we all know that there are many sectors of the codes, apart from the general codes. So we as verification agencies have to comply with that. We've got to look at the targets based on each of the sector codes as well as the overall codes. And we've got to actually verify and sample and audit employment equity and management control the way it is. So these E regulations, I guess, would have some kind of an indirect impact, but no direct impact. But I think at this point as well, it's probably still unclear as to how this will impact BEE, especially for the generic scorecards, because the management control and the skills development elements of these scorecards are also based on what we call the EAPs, the economically active population percentage, or the sectoral targets. So at this stage, I guess, my answer is that will not be too clear yet. But when it comes to the verification, the actual audit process, I don't believe that it will impact tremendously.
All right, great, thank you.
Yeah. Frik, that certificate of compliance that you talked about, I mean, is there any kind of indication on when those certificates of compliance would become effective? I mean, we do a lot of public tender work as well. We're very often, like every other week, we're applying for tenders when we get requests. So, I mean, is there any idea or nothing yet on when they will become compliant?
Yeah,
effective, rather.
Yeah, so, like I mentioned, we don't have an effective date for any of this yet. But one thing I do want to mention is that it's going to take a bit more time than what people realize. So what I mean by that is, let's say the department says effective date for new plans 1st September this year. Now companies develop plans to meet over 5 years the sectoral targets, but they will have targets for end of August next year. Then they will report after August next year, towards January 2025, will they report the first time on the plan that includes the sectoral targets. So that certificate of compliance includes the how well you are meeting your own targets towards the sectoral targets. So the implication is the first time that the department can actually issue these certificates will be after January 2025, once you've reported for them to see, have you actually met your targets? So that would be the soonest, but things happen in this space. It could actually be another year or 2 or 3, just depending.
Yeah, absolutely. Considering the earlier delays from the drafts, being out in 2020, so it's been quite a space of time.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Right.
Okay.
So if I can then ask you, entities that do not submit their returns, will they still be required to be verified? So the non-designated companies, how's that going to impact that part of the amendments? How will that impact BE verification?
I think that all entities, irrespective of what their legal requirements are, are still required to be verified. So the short answer to that is yes, they will still need to be verified, because when you're being verified for a BEE audit, management control, employment, it's an Employment Equity Act element, so it's got to be assessed. So but I think to ease the reporting burden on small businesses, the turnover thresholds. I think the turnover thresholds have fallen away, and only companies now with a headcount of 50 employees, as we said, or more, are now required to report on their employment equity figures by submitting those EEA reports. So it will apply to those. Yeah, it will apply to those entities. I think, given the challenging sectoral targets that you talked about as well, now in place, it could result in smaller companies being disincentivized to grow their numbers, I suppose, employee-wise, as people that are in their employ. I mean, that's just a remark from this. But yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. They will still be required to be verified.
Okay. Can I just a follow-on question? Do you foresee that? I know it's not. There's been no communication as such, but do you foresee that during verification going forward, somewhere in the future after 2025, that verification agencies will start asking, or that it will be part of the verification for a company to produce that certificate of compliance?
Yes, I think it would be after 2025. But then also we've got to wait to see what those requirements are going to be, what the prerequisites are going to be, and all of that, because those requirements might change as well. But I think we will be.
Moving target, right?
Yes, Maybe just a last quick question. Just when will these small companies become non-designated?
Okay, so interesting. For me, this was an interesting one, and maybe you want to also, just add on to what I'm saying in terms of from a legal perspective. But what's interesting for me is there was communication in this week actually around small companies, your non-designated companies, that indicated that it sounded from that letter from the department basically that they are already now non-designated. So the letter is about other things, about how do those non-designated companies now go about doing things in terms of this. Should they deregister, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, what was interesting is if I think that we don't have an effective date yet gazetted by the president, is it possible that they are already non-designated? So I'm actually answering your question with the question. So, what's your view on that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with what you're saying. I mean, again, what you're saying is that, they regarded what we are looking at them as being non-designated right now, right? And I think what we're going to have to do is, we have to await finalization of this. So at this point in time, I don't really have an opinion, but I would tend to think that, they are non-designated, and let's see whether it changes once everything is finalized.
Good.
Yep. So that's basically the questions.
Yeah, I think we are done. Sharon, can we hand back to you? Thank you.
Hi. I must admit some of your terminology had my brain spinning. And one or two of the questions I'm going to ask are really basic before I pick up on the few that we've got, or actually maybe more than that from the floor. One of the things that you were both talking about, and I'm now talking about human behavior, you're saying that certain companies under 50 people now don't need to do things. And you talked about the risk of them keeping their numbers under the 50 because of the unintended outcomes of us being human beings and doing the things in a certain way. Out of that, I would see that is a large number of entities, formal and informal, obviously. So that is a high number, which takes a lot of admin out of the department because you've moved a large quantity of entities. But that must be a fairly 80-20 style contribution towards the economy, being the smaller companies. And my question comes from the owner, founder, business attitude. Well, therefore, black empowerment is not a problem. I'm going to carry on doing what is best by my business. I'm going to take no cognizance of any form of what is the right thing to do by our population. Is that a risk for business owners potentially starting to think like that?
Who's taking that question?
Usha, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, sure, Sharon. So when we look at when we talk BEE and we talk BEE verification, the companies, the companies that we audit are made up of different categories. So you get the one category which is called exempt micro enterprises. right? Exempt micro enterprises are companies who have a turnover of between 0 and 10 million per annum. Then after the AMEs, you get what we call qualifying small enterprises whose turnover is between the 10 and the 50 million mark. Now, again, as one of the rules is that if EME or a qualifying small enterprise with those turnovers of under 50 million, if they have at least 51% Black ownership, they do not require a full BEE audit. All that happens with them is that they've got to provide an affidavit. And these are affidavits, these are affidavits that apply to companies in the various sectors and sector codes. So when it comes to that, irrespective of the number of employees they have, whether it's below 50 or more than 50, they will still fall within that target of the 10 million or the 50 million turnover. So that's turnover based, and it's got nothing to do with the number of employees. So there's no risk there or anything like that. Where you have an entity which has a turnover in excess of 50 million, and there again, if the employees are more than 50 or less than 50, then you've got to comply with this requirement of reporting your employment equity figures in terms of an EA report and do an EA reporting system. So again, in our country, I'm not sure if anyone's done this exercise to determine how many companies are in each of these three categories. The number of companies. I mean, there are lots of smaller companies as well, but likewise, you get multinationals and you get the larger entities. So we call them large entities over 50 million. But that's the way it would work.
So yeah, thank you, Frik. From your point of view, before I try and distill my understanding.
Okay, so I think I just want to highlight two things really. The one is that we must realize that the small companies below the non-designated, below 50 employees, still, it's not like they don't have to comply with anything. They still need to comply. So the purpose of the Act is twofold. The first part is eradicate unfair discrimination, and the second part is implement affirmative action. They still have to eradicate unfair discrimination. So all of the Act applies except the part that talks about the duties of a designated employer. So a designated company must do certain things. You must consult with your staff members through a committee. You must develop an EE plan. You must report every year, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very clear what are those duties. And those, the non-designated companies don't need to do that anymore. But they still need to, implement all of the rest of the Act. So that was the one comment I wanted to make. And I think I've now forgotten what the other one was. I don't even know if I've answered your question, Sharon. Did I even link into your question?
No, thank you very much. The issue was the country has come such a long way in its Black empowerment activities of giving everybody fair, equitable chance of getting jobs and employment. And then you've got the Equity Employment Act, which is not negating Black empowerment. So it's getting those two aspects clearly in the mind of people, that they are still doing more than one thing that they have to do to look after the fairness of people getting jobs. So thank you. I think we've done reasonably well on that. Another one also, just relating again to human behavior. It's a draft. It's not implemented yet. The earliest possible is 1st of September, therefore January 2025. That's tomorrow's problem. I'm not bothered now. What is that risk? Is it real? And how does that get managed by people like yourselves that are in this industry, trying to make people understand that if you don't take the steps now, you can't achieve it at the end. But it seems so far away. 18 months is a long time in many businesses' lives. That's a huge amount of time. How do we get them to be mindful now?
Is that addressed to me?
Okay, go for it, Frik.
Okay, sorry.
It's probably more your consulting area.
Yeah, I think what we need to still realize is nothing has again changed in terms of fines, etc., etc. So the department can inspect you in November this year if it comes into play in September, and you're going to have a plan that includes the sectoral targets. So in terms of meeting the duties of a designated employer, if you don't do those things, there's still the liability or possibility of a fine. And those fines, as we know, range between 1.5 million rand up to 10% of turnover, which they are big. those fines are huge. So that would be my message. Yes, you can take the chance. And I've remembered my other point from just now. You said, companies trying to stay below 50. I've even had discussions with companies saying to me, but let's just break this company up into small chunks to, for all of them to be under 50. In theory, that might work. But when you start looking at a business case for actually doing that, then it doesn't make sense. But yes, so that would be my response. Remember, the fines, the inspections, all of the duties must still be covered. Nothing's changed in that regard.
Okay, that's actually quite a big message. One of our delegates is asking what sort of documentation will be required for a management control of a non-designated employer.
Sorry, I didn't hear you clearly, Sharon.
There's a question. What B-BBEE documentation will be required for management control for non-designated employers?
We have set requirements for each element, but for management control, remember it's made up of the top management, which is directors, executive, non-executive directors. What we request and what we ask for is, number one, their employment contracts, copies of their IDs, their pay slips. The reason we ask for pay slips also, we look at if there's any discrepancies, whether there are huge discrepancies between directors based on race, gender, and those kinds of things as well. So that's the type of information. And then what we do is that we select a sample and we interview them. A similar thing applies for employment equity as well. The people on senior, middle, and junior management level. We get their contracts and we get pay slips and we do interviews, IDs.
Frik, I'm not sure if it's your area. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
So I think I just wanted to mention at the moment, but Usha, you must correct me if I'm wrong. But they would ask for the EEA2 at least. Your employment equity report to the department would be one of the aspects. So for small companies, they're no longer going to do that. So they won't have an EEA2. And that's my question earlier on about maybe I would recommend that to verification agencies if you want to check that small businesses are compliant with the Act, because that's what you really want to see before you award points for management control. Then use the certificate of compliance. The department's already checked whether you as a small business is complying with the Act or not.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and maybe Frik, just to complete that as well, we do request EEA2 and EEA4 reports. But the reason for that also is from an audit point of view. We've got to do a comparison. We take the latest report, the EEA report. We've got to do a comparison with the total number of employees on the EEA report as compared to what we are auditing. But of course, our audit comes months later. But we do that comparison. So we do request EA2 and 4 reports automatically. It's part of our list.
Yeah.
The comment request here, is it true that the e-compliance certificate will also be utilized for the management control element of the scorecard?
It's going to apply to public sector entities only.
Okay,
is my understanding of the compliance certificate. Yeah.
Frik, anything to add to that nice, short and succinct feedback?
Yeah, I think that was my earlier question to Usha, is that I think that going forward, probably agencies will start asking for that certificate. I would recommend that, yes. So, and also, like I said, I think the pressure for that certificate, although the Act only talks about public procurement, I do think it's going to filter down to your clients, putting pressure on you to, a company like ABSA or Cell C or Telkom, those companies that are serious about corporate governance. Well, I would if I was a company like that. If I want to do business with you, you must show me that you are complying with this Act. So I think it's going to go broader than just government asking.
Just a last question of each of you quickly. Frik, from your perspective, what are you seeing as in the context of this Act? What are people finding the most difficult to get their mind or processes around as we stand today?
Yes, I would say meeting those sectoral targets. For some companies, they are sitting on 5% representation, and the EAP or the sectoral targets want 25% of African males at the level or something. Most of the companies that because I've done comparisons, as I'm preparing, assisting companies now with plans, we already do the comparison with the draft sectoral targets to give them an idea of where are they at. And it's going to be difficult. People are going to struggle. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest risk, and also the biggest concern for most companies.
And as you said, we don't know if it's coming, so I'm sure everyone is sitting there with everything crossed in effort that it's not 1st of September.
Yeah, it is a matter of when, though. It's not if, it's when.
Even though we're 3 years late on where it started. Last question of you, Usha. In the area of your audit work, where do you typically find companies are falling short? Not everywhere,
Skills
please.
development.
Skills development.
So the training element, we find, because ownership and management control and employment equity are what we call the people, the human elements. We have no control over that because people have to employ who they need. But for the rest of the elements, which are based on financial figure targets, skills development for us seems to be the most challenging because it's about monies that have to be spent. And they've got to spend quite a lot of money in order to ensure that they're meeting at least the sub-minimum points that they require. Because if they don't meet certain sub-minimum points, then they are discounted to a lower level. And that can be very damaging as well, because you find that many organizations are requesting at least a BEE level 4 or a BEE level 3. And skills development is a challenging one. And the other one also is the enterprise and supply development, which are contributions that have to be made, and they cost money. So those would be the elements, but I would top it with skills training.
And to that point, to all our listeners, I think it's 1 or 2 sessions back, we actually had a session on skills development. So please, to pick up on Usha's previous comments, please have a look at the skills development section and webinar, where we address that in more detail than Usha's had an opportunity to pick up on now. Thank you very much to both of my guests. You've been absolutely fantastic. You scrambled my brain again, but I hope I tried to unscramble some of it for me and those that are listening, and hopefully got us to a slightly better understanding. And I think, to quote somebody well known in the US, the unknown unknown is sitting in a big unknown space. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And to those who would like to make contact with them, either through ourselves or through the BEE Association, or direct with the individuals, please feel free to do so. And I do see that a couple of other questions did pop up in the last few moments. Sorry, I haven't been able to cover all of them, but I do see actually at a quick glance, some of those we actually have handled already. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.